Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a question that has followed humanity for thousands of years. Why do humans come in different colours? Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many corners of the world gather here each night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of human skin colour begins long before cities, kingdoms, taxes, or any of humanity's other regrettable inventions. To understand why humans come in different shades today, we need to travel back to the birthplace of our species, Africa. Around 200,000 years ago, the first modern humans appeared on the African continent. They lived beneath some of the strongest sunlight on Earth, in landscapes where shade was often a luxury rather than a guarantee. Every day, the sun poured down ultraviolet radiation with all the subtlety of a king collecting overdue taxes. This presented a problem. Ultraviolet radiation is useful in small amounts, but too much can damage DNA, increase health risks, and interfere with important biological processes. The sun, meanwhile, was completely indifferent to these concerns. It had been shining for billions of years before humans arrived, and had no intention of changing its behaviour now. Fortunately, evolution had already been working overtime. Human skin contains a pigment called melanin. The more melanin present, the darker the skin appears. More importantly, melanin acts like a natural protective shield, helping to absorb and disperse harmful ultraviolet radiation before it can cause serious damage. For early humans, this protection was incredibly valuable. One reason involved folate, a vitamin essential for reproduction and healthy fetal development. Excessive ultraviolet exposure can break down folate levels in the body. Individuals with higher melanin levels were better protected from this problem and therefore had a better chance of producing healthy children. Natural selection noticed. Natural selection notices everything. It is essentially the most relentless performance review system ever created. There are no meetings, no warning letters, and absolutely no appeals process. Over thousands upon thousands of generations, dark skin became the standard condition for humanity. It was not a cultural choice. It was not a fashion trend. No prehistoric influencer was posting cave paintings titled 10 Simple Tricks to Get the Perfect Bronze Glow. Dark skin simply worked. And when something works for long enough in evolution, it tends to stick around. If you could visit one of these early human communities, you would quickly discover that skin colour was not exactly a major topic of discussion. People were busy hunting animals that could kill them, gathering food that might poison them, avoiding predators, surviving diseases, and trying not to become an unfortunate lesson for the rest of the tribe. Compared to those concerns, pigmentation ranked fairly low on the daily agenda. For tens of thousands of years, humanity remained largely within Africa, and dark skin served our ancestors remarkably well. Evolution had found an effective solution to life under an intense equatorial sun. Everything seemed settled. Then humans did what humans have always done whenever things are going reasonably well. They started wandering off. Some groups moved north, others headed east. Some followed coastlines, rivers, and animal migrations into lands their ancestors had never seen before. They crossed deserts, mountains, forests, and grasslands with remarkable determination and absolutely no idea where they were going. Human history, in many ways, begins with somebody looking over the horizon and thinking, I wonder what's over there. The answer, as it turned out, was different climates, different environments, and eventually different skin colours. Because once humanity left Africa, it would begin a very long argument with the sun. And the sun, as always, had opinions. For tens of thousands of years, humanity remained in Africa. Dark skin protected people from the intense equatorial sunlight. Food was found where food could be found, and life continued much as it always had. Then, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, groups of humans began leaving. Nobody knows exactly who started the journey. History rarely records the names of the first people to do something important. We know the names of kings, emperors, and generals. We do not know the name of the first person who looked toward an unfamiliar horizon and thought, let's see what's over there. That individual accidentally helped reshape the appearance of the entire human species. Small groups slowly migrated out of Africa and into the Middle East. From there, they spread farther into Asia, Europe, and eventually every habitable continent on Earth except Antarctica, which remains humanity's way of saying, perhaps not every place needs a city. These migrations did not happen quickly. People were not marching across continents with a destination in mind. There was no giant map labelled Future Europe. There were no travel brochures promising beautiful views and excellent vitamin D deficiencies. Generation after generation simply moved a little farther. A river valley looked promising. A herd of animals wandered north. A drought forced a community to relocate. Thousands of tiny decisions gradually carried humanity across the globe. As these groups entered new regions, they encountered environments completely different from those of their African ancestors. Forests replaced grasslands. Winters became colder. Days became shorter. Most importantly, sunlight became weaker. The farther people moved from the equator, the less ultraviolet radiation reached the ground. At first, this seemed like good news. After all, less dangerous radiation sounded like a benefit. But evolution enjoys turning simple problems into complicated ones. The same ultraviolet radiation that could damage the body was also necessary for producing vitamin D. Humans need vitamin D for healthy bones, proper immune function, and overall survival. Suddenly, the trait that had protected humanity for thousands of generations faced a new challenge. Dark skin was excellent at blocking ultraviolet radiation. The problem was that, in northern regions, there wasn't nearly as much radiation to block. Imagine arriving at a village carrying the world's largest umbrella, only to discover that it barely rains there. The umbrella is still impressive. It is simply no longer solving the most urgent problem. And so, as humans spread into new lands, natural selection began preparing a new set of adjustments. The sun had changed the rules. Evolution was about to respond. As human populations spread farther from the equator, they discovered that escaping intense sunlight came with an unexpected drawback. The sun, despite its many flaws, actually provides something humans need: vitamin D. Unlike most vitamins, vitamin D is not something the body relies entirely on food to obtain. Human skin can produce it when exposed to ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. This process helped our ancestors maintain strong bones, healthy immune systems, and functioning bodies. For thousands of generations in Africa, this had not been a problem. Sunlight was abundant, perhaps excessively abundant. If the African sun were a landlord, nobody could accuse it of failing to show up. But conditions were different in northern regions. The farther humans travelled from the equator, the weaker the ultraviolet radiation became. Long winters reduced exposure even further. In some places, months could pass with very little useful sunlight reaching people's skin. This created a biological dilemma. Dark skin had evolved to protect against excessive ultraviolet radiation. It was extremely effective at doing its job, perhaps a little too effective. In regions with limited sunlight, large amounts of melanin could reduce the body's ability to produce enough vitamin D. Suddenly, humanity faced a problem that had never existed before. Too much sunlight could be harmful. Too little sunlight could also be harmful. Evolution now had to walk a very narrow path between the two. Individuals whose skin allowed slightly more ultraviolet radiation to penetrate often had an advantage in northern environments. They could produce vitamin D more efficiently, maintain healthier bones, and increase their chances of surviving long enough to have children. Natural selection immediately took an interest, and when natural selection takes an interest in something, it tends to remain interested for several thousand years. The effects of vitamin D deficiency could be serious. Children might develop weakened bones or skeletal deformities. Adults could suffer from various health problems. Communities living in regions with limited sunlight needed a solution. Fortunately, evolution specializes in solving problems through endless experimentation. Not intelligent experimentation, not organized experimentation, more the biological equivalent of throwing millions of tiny changes at a wall and seeing what sticks. Over countless generations, populations living in northern regions gradually began developing lighter skin. Nobody noticed this happening. There was no dramatic announcement. No tribe gathered around a campfire saying, "Interesting development, everyone. We appear to be evolving." The changes were so gradual that individual generations would never have perceived them. Yet century after century, millennia after millennia, they accumulated. Humanity had left Africa carrying one solution. Now different environments were demanding new ones. And slowly, almost invisibly, the colours of humanity began to diversify. The changes that eventually produced lighter skin did not happen in a single generation, a single century, or even a single civilization. Evolution does not work like a movie montage. Nobody went to sleep with dark skin and woke up looking Scandinavian. Instead, tiny genetic variations accumulated over thousands of years. Every generation contained small differences. Some individuals naturally produced slightly less melanin than others. In northern environments, where sunlight was limited, those differences could sometimes provide an advantage. A person with slightly lighter skin might produce vitamin D a little more efficiently. That person might enjoy better health. They might survive harsh winters more successfully. They might raise more children who inherited similar traits. And so the process continued. Not because evolution had a goal. Not because nature was trying to create particular groups of people. Nature does not plan ahead. Nature simply rewards whatever happens to work at a given moment. It is less like an architect, and more like a mechanic desperately trying random fixes until the machine starts running again. Over many thousands of years, populations living in northern regions gradually became lighter-skinned. Europe provides one of the most famous examples. Ancient hunter-gatherers who first entered Europe were not necessarily as pale as many modern Europeans. Genetic evidence suggests that some early Europeans still possessed relatively dark skin despite living in northern latitudes. The transition toward lighter skin happened gradually and continued long after humans first arrived. Agriculture may have accelerated the process. When people relied heavily on hunting and fishing, they often obtained vitamin D from their food. But as farming spread, diets changed. Many agricultural communities consumed fewer vitamin D-rich foods. This made efficient vitamin D production from sunlight even more important. Natural selection responded accordingly. Generation after generation, lighter pigmentation became increasingly common. But here's where the story becomes especially interesting. Europe was not the only place where lighter skin evolved. Different populations in East Asia also developed lighter skin. The remarkable part is that they often achieved this through different genetic pathways. In other words, nature arrived at similar results using different biological tools. It's a little like two inventors independently creating bicycles without ever meeting each other. Different designs, same destination. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that skin color evolved primarily as an adaptation to local environments rather than as part of some grand human blueprint. The sun was still influencing the process, just in a different way than it had in Africa. For hundreds of generations, northern populations were being shaped not by too much sunlight, but by too little. And as humanity continued spreading across the world, the palette of human skin tones grew increasingly diverse. The great artist known as evolution had begun mixing new colors. At first glance, the story seems simple. Humans moved into regions with less sunlight. Over time, lighter skin evolved to help produce more vitamin D. Problem solved. But evolution rarely settles for a simple explanation when it can make things far more complicated. When scientists began studying the genetics behind skin color, they expected to find a single pathway responsible for lighter skin across the world. Instead, they found something unexpected. Europeans and East Asians often developed lighter skin through different combinations of genes. The destination was similar. The routes were completely different. Imagine two groups of engineers separated by thousands of miles. Both are asked to build a bridge across a river. One uses stone arches. The other uses suspension cables. Different methods. Same objective. Evolution had done something very similar. In Europe, several genes associated with lighter skin became increasingly common over thousands of years. In East Asia, other genetic variations played important roles. The end result was populations with lighter complexions, but the biological roads leading there were not identical. This discovery revealed something fascinating about evolution. It does not follow a master plan. There is no blueprint hidden somewhere in nature's filing cabinet labeled "How Humans Should Look." Instead, evolution works with whatever genetic variations happen to be available. If one solution works, it gets rewarded. If another solution works just as well, it also gets rewarded. Nature is surprisingly flexible for a process that has never attended a planning meeting. This also explains why skin color varies so much across the world. Human populations were adapting independently for thousands of years. Different environments created different pressures. Different genetic changes appeared in different groups. The result was not a handful of neatly defined categories, but a vast spectrum of human appearances. Even within the same continent, skin tones could vary dramatically. Mountains, coastlines, forests, and deserts all influenced how populations evolved. Migration added another layer of complexity as groups mixed and exchanged genetic traits. Humanity was becoming increasingly diverse. Yet beneath that diversity, something important remained true. All humans still shared remarkably similar ancestry. The differences that evolved over thousands of years were real, but they represented only a tiny fraction of our overall genetic makeup. Unfortunately, future societies would often focus obsessively on those visible differences. Humans have always had a talent for taking a relatively minor biological variation and building entire political systems around it. Evolution merely produced skin color. People would later supply the arguments. For now, however, the story remained one of adaptation. The sun continued shaping humanity, population by population, region by region, and while some groups were growing lighter, many others remained exactly where darker skin continued to offer the greatest advantage. While some human populations were gradually evolving lighter skin in northern regions, millions of others remained much closer to the equator, and near the equator, the sun was still behaving exactly as it always had, aggressively. The sunlight striking tropical and subtropical regions contains far more ultraviolet radiation than the sunlight reaching northern Europe or northern Asia. Day after day, year after year, people living in these regions continued facing the same environmental challenge their distant ancestors had encountered in Africa: too much ultraviolet radiation. In these environments, dark skin remained one of the most effective biological tools available. The high levels of melanin provided protection against sun damage, helped preserve folate levels, and reduced many of the risks associated with constant exposure to intense sunlight. From evolution's perspective, there was very little reason to change a system that was already working, and evolution is famously economical. If a solution works, it tends to keep using it. Unlike humans, who routinely abandon perfectly functional technology because a newer version comes with slightly rounder corners. Across Africa, parts of South Asia, Australia, Melanesia, and numerous Pacific regions, darker skin continued providing important advantages. These populations were not somehow behind other groups on an evolutionary path. There was no path. That is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about evolution. Evolution does not move toward a final destination. It does not rank populations. It does not hand out medals. It simply favors traits that increase survival and reproduction in a specific environment. A polar bear is not more evolved than a camel. A camel is not more evolved than a dolphin. And dark skin is not more evolved or less evolved than light skin. They are simply different solutions to different environmental problems. Nature, unlike social media, is not running a popularity contest. As humans spread across the globe, local environments continuously shaped local adaptations. Near the equator, darker pigmentation remained highly advantageous. Farther north, lighter pigmentation became increasingly useful. The result was a growing spectrum of skin tones appearing across different populations. Yet despite these visible differences, all humans remained extraordinarily similar. In fact, if you compare the DNA of people from opposite sides of the planet, you'll find they share the overwhelming majority of their genetic code. The differences are real. They're just much smaller than they appear. Unfortunately, humans have never been particularly good at judging importance based on size. A tiny variation in skin color would eventually become one of the most discussed features in human history. Meanwhile, the genes responsible for it occupied only a microscopic portion of the human genome. Nature had painted humanity in many shades. Humans would later spend centuries arguing about the paint, instead of appreciating the canvas. When most people think about human skin color, they often imagine a handful of distinct categories: light, dark, maybe a few shades in between. Nature, however, has never been particularly interested in neat categories. Nature prefers gradients. Humans prefer filing cabinets. As populations spread across the globe and adapted to different environments, skin color developed across an enormous spectrum. There was never a sharp line where one shade ended and another began. Instead, neighboring populations often blended gradually into one another. creating countless variations. If you traveled from Central Africa to Northern Europe thousands of years ago, you would not encounter sudden jumps in skin color every few hundred miles. Instead, you would observe subtle changes accumulating gradually across generations and regions. The closer populations lived to one another, the more they tended to mix. And humans mixed constantly. Despite what history books sometimes imply, people have never been particularly good at staying separated. Traders crossed deserts, sailors crossed oceans, nomads crossed grasslands, armies crossed borders. Sometimes people met peacefully, sometimes they met with weapons. Either way, genes tended to travel. As a result, skin color became influenced not only by sunlight, but also by migration and intermarriage. Entire populations carried traces of ancient journeys within their DNA. A person living today may inherit genetic influences from dozens of different ancestral populations without realizing it. Their family tree resembles less of a tree and more of a bowl of tangled fishing lines. This explains why skin color can vary so dramatically even within the same country or region. Human history has always involved movement, and movement creates diversity. Scientists sometimes describe skin color as a cline, meaning a gradual change across geography rather than a collection of separate groups. This reflects reality far better than the rigid categories many societies later invented. The problem is that human brains love simple labels. We like dividing things into boxes. Boxes feel organized. Boxes feel understandable. Boxes also tend to fall apart when confronted with actual biology, because biology is messy, extremely messy. The closer scientists examine human genetic variation, the more they discover that nature rarely draws clean boundaries. Most traits exist on spectrums. Skin color is one of the most obvious examples. What emerged over tens of thousands of years was not a collection of separate human types. It was one species expressing different adaptations across different environments, a vast mosaic of shades, tones, and complexions shaped by sunlight, geography, and migration. Nature had spent thousands of generations painting subtle transitions. Humans would later arrive with rulers and labels, determined to draw straight lines where none actually existed. If skin color were influenced only by sunlight, the story would be relatively straightforward. Humans leave Africa. Different environments create different pressures. Different skin tones emerge. Everyone goes home. History, unfortunately, never chooses the straightforward option. The moment humans began spreading across the globe, they also began doing something else remarkably well, moving around constantly. For thousands of years, populations rarely remained isolated. Even groups separated by deserts, mountains, or oceans eventually found ways to connect. Trade routes appeared, migrations occurred, kingdoms expanded, empires rose and fell. Entire communities relocated because of droughts, wars, opportunities, or simple curiosity. Humanity has always been astonishingly bad at staying put. Take the ancient Silk Road, for example. Goods travelled between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But silk wasn't the only thing moving. People moved too. Merchants settled in foreign cities. Travellers married locals. Families formed across cultural boundaries. Genes quietly crossed continents while historians focused on the trade statistics. The Mediterranean became another giant mixing bowl. Greeks, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Romans, Berbers, Arabs, and countless others interacted for centuries. Ports were filled with sailors from every corner of the known world. If ancient DNA could speak, it would probably spend most of its time saying, "It's complicated." The same pattern appeared almost everywhere. Nomadic groups crossed vast grasslands in Eurasia. Seafaring peoples settled distant islands across the Pacific. Bantu-speaking populations spread across much of Africa. The Americas witnessed migrations over thousands of years before written history even began. Human populations were constantly blending, separating, and blending again. This movement had a major effect on skin color. While sunlight continued shaping local adaptations, migration introduced new genetic variations into populations. Traits that evolved in one region could spread into another. Over generations, entirely new combinations appeared. The result was a remarkable diversity of appearances. No region remained completely unchanged forever. Even populations that seemed isolated often experienced contact with outsiders at some point in their history. This is one reason scientists become cautious whenever someone talks about pure populations. Human history is essentially one long story of mixing. The farther researchers look into the past, the more interconnected humanity appears. Entire civilizations that believe themselves separate often turn out to have shared ancestors somewhere along the line. The irony is almost amusing. Humans spent centuries arguing about differences while their DNA quietly recorded thousands of years of cooperation, migration, and intermarriage. Beneath every skin tone lies the same story. People moving, people meeting, people having children, and completely confusing future historians. When people hear the word evolution, they often imagine changes happening so slowly that nobody could ever notice them. Mountains rise, continents drift, a few million years pass, then perhaps something interesting happens. While evolution can certainly move at that pace, skin color tells a different story. Compared to many other traits, human pigmentation can change surprisingly quickly. Quickly, of course, is a relative term. We're still talking about centuries and thousands of years rather than a particularly productive weekend. But in evolutionary terms, that's practically breaking news. Scientists studying ancient DNA have discovered that some populations changed skin pigmentation far more recently than many people realize. In Europe, for example, lighter skin became widespread thousands of years after humans first arrived there. The first hunter-gatherers who entered Europe were not necessarily pale-skinned by modern standards. Genetic evidence suggests that many early Europeans still carried relatively dark pigmentation. Then things began to change. Agriculture arrived. Populations grew. Diets shifted. And natural selection got busy. One important factor was food. Early hunter-gatherers often consumed fish, game, and other foods rich in vitamin D. Even in regions with limited sunlight, these diets helped compensate for lower vitamin D production. Farmers, however, frequently relied on grains and crops that contained much less vitamin D. Suddenly, producing vitamin D through sunlight became even more important. Lighter skin gained an advantage. Generation after generation, that advantage accumulated. The process wasn't dramatic. No farmer woke up one morning and announced, "Good news, everyone. We appear to be evolving." The changes were invisible within individual lifetimes. Yet over many centuries, they transformed entire populations. This demonstrates an important principle. Evolution responds to environmental pressures. When conditions change, populations can adapt remarkably quickly. Not instantly. Not magically, but far faster than most people imagine. The same pattern occurred elsewhere around the world. Different populations encountered different climates, diets, and living conditions. Natural selection responded accordingly, favoring traits that improved survival under local circumstances. Skin color was one of the most visible results. What's remarkable is that all of this happened without planning, direction, or intention. No committee designed humanity's color palette. No ancient civilization issued pigmentation guidelines. The process emerged naturally from countless generations interacting with their environments. One small advantage at a time, one child at a time, one generation at a time, and before anyone realized it, humanity had developed an extraordinary range of skin tones spread across the globe, all because the sun, geography, and biology had been quietly collaborating for thousands of years without ever scheduling a single meeting. By the time humanity had spread across the globe, adapted to different climates, and developed a wide range of skin tones, an outside observer might have concluded that different groups of humans were becoming fundamentally different from one another. Many people throughout history certainly reached that conclusion. The problem is that they were wrong, very wrong. In fact, modern genetics has revealed something that would probably surprise many of our ancestors. Humans are remarkably similar. A person from Nigeria, Norway, China, Peru, or Australia shares approximately 99.9% of their DNA with every other human being on Earth. Think about that for a moment. Entire empires were built on the assumption that human groups were radically different from one another. Wars were fought, laws were written, societies were divided, and all the while, humanity was arguing over a fraction of a percent. It's rather like spending centuries fighting over different paint colours on houses, while ignoring the fact that the houses themselves are almost identical. Skin colour, despite being one of the most noticeable human traits, is controlled by a relatively small number of genes. Those genes affect the amount and distribution of melanin in the skin. That's it. They do not determine intelligence. They do not determine character. They do not determine creativity. They do not determine courage. The sun was adjusting humanity's sunscreen settings, not creating separate versions of the species. Unfortunately, humans have always been experts at taking visible differences and assigning them enormous importance. Throughout history, people often assumed that what they could easily see must also be the most meaningful thing about someone. Biology disagrees. When scientists compare human populations, they often find more genetic variation within groups than between groups. Two people from the same region can sometimes be more genetically different from each other than either is from someone living on another continent. Nature once again refuses to fit neatly into human categories. This doesn't mean human populations don't have unique histories or adaptations. They absolutely do. The migrations, environments, and cultures that shaped different groups are real and fascinating. But those differences exist within a single human family, a very large family. A family that occasionally argues at holiday gatherings, invades neighbouring territories, and invents complicated theories about itself. Yet still one family. The deeper scientists look into our DNA, the clearer this becomes. All humans ultimately share common ancestors. All humans emerged from the same African origins, and all humans carry evidence of that shared history. The irony is almost perfect. The more science learns about humanity, the harder it becomes to divide humanity into separate biological boxes. Nature spent hundreds of thousands of years connecting us. Humans spent a few thousand years trying to draw lines through the middle of the picture. For most of human history, skin colour was simply an adaptation. It helped people survive in the environments where they lived. The sun influenced it. Geography influenced it. Migration influenced it. But eventually humans did what humans often do. They took a biological trait and turned it into a social one. Long before modern ideas about race emerged, many societies began attaching status and meaning to skin colour. Interestingly, these early attitudes were often very different from what people might expect today. In ancient Egypt, for example, artwork frequently depicted people using different skin tones. Men were often painted darker than women, partly because men spent more time working outdoors, while women were associated with indoor activities. These artistic conventions reflected daily life rather than rigid racial categories. In ancient Greece and Rome, lighter skin often became associated with wealth and status. The reason was surprisingly simple. If your skin remained pale, it suggested you did not spend your days labouring under the sun. You had servants. You owned land. You possessed leisure. In other words, you were rich. A farmer working endless hours in the fields would naturally develop darker, sun-exposed skin. A wealthy aristocrat lounging indoors discussing philosophy, politics, or which neighbouring city deserved invading next could maintain a lighter complexion. The Roman elite even used cosmetics to make themselves appear paler. Some women applied powders containing lead to whiten their skin. This was not one of history's better beauty tips. The skin became lighter. The poisoning was less ideal. Across medieval Europe, similar attitudes persisted. Noble women avoided direct sunlight whenever possible. Pale skin became a visible sign that someone belonged to the upper classes rather than the agricultural workforce. The same pattern appeared in parts of Asia. In imperial China and later in Japan, pale skin often symbolized refinement and status. Wealthy families could afford lives spent indoors, while farmers worked under the open sky. The distinction was economic more than racial. It was not about ancestry. It was about occupation. The sun had unintentionally become a social marker. A tan often meant labour. Pale skin often meant privilege. Of course, this was deeply ironic. For hundreds of thousands of years, skin colour had evolved primarily because of environmental survival. Now societies were assigning entirely new meanings to it. Nature had created pigmentation to deal with ultraviolet radiation. Humans transformed it into a status symbol. And as trade networks expanded, empires grew, and distant populations encountered one another more frequently, these social ideas about skin colour would become increasingly complicated. Soon, pigmentation would become entangled with power, conquest, and identity. The biology would remain the same. The politics, however, were only getting started. For most of history, people certainly noticed differences in appearance. They noticed language differences, religious differences, cultural differences. They noticed clothing, hairstyles, accents, and customs. What they generally did not have was the modern concept of race. That idea emerged much later. Beginning in the late 15th century, European explorers, merchants, missionaries and conquerors began travelling across the globe on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, populations that had been separated for thousands of years were encountering one another more frequently than ever before. Ships crossed oceans, empires expanded, trade routes connected continents, and humanity found itself meeting distant relatives it had not seen in a very long time. At first, many Europeans struggled to understand the incredible diversity they encountered. People looked different, spoke different languages, practiced different religions, lived in unfamiliar ways. The world suddenly seemed much larger than many had imagined. Unfortunately, curiosity was not the only thing travelling aboard those ships. So were greed, conquest, and ambition. As European colonial empires expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, governments and scholars increasingly sought ways to classify the populations they encountered. Humans love classification. We classify animals. We classify plants. We classify clouds. Given enough time, humans will attempt to classify absolutely anything, including themselves. By the 17th and 18th centuries, some European thinkers began dividing humanity into broad racial categories based largely on physical characteristics such as skin colour. These classifications often claimed to be scientific. They were not, at least not by modern standards. Many were based on assumptions, cultural biases, and political interests, rather than rigorous evidence. Conveniently, these theories often place the people creating the classifications at the top. History contains a surprising number of systems in which the authors somehow conclude that they are the best example of humanity, an extraordinary coincidence. These racial theories became increasingly influential during the era of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Visible differences in skin colour were used to justify systems of exploitation, conquest, and inequality. Biological adaptations that had evolved because of sunlight and geography were suddenly being treated as evidence of deeper divisions between human beings. Yet the science behind these claims was remarkably weak. The people creating these categories had no understanding of genetics, no knowledge of DNA, no way of tracing humanity's shared origins. They were attempting to explain human diversity while missing many of the most important pieces of the puzzle. For centuries, these ideas shaped laws, societies, and empires. But as science advanced during the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers began uncovering evidence that challenged these assumptions. The more scientists learned about human biology, the less support they found for rigid racial divisions. Ironically, the very scientific methods used to create racial categories would eventually help dismantle them. And the next discoveries would completely transform our understanding of who we really are. For centuries, people argued about human differences using little more than observation. They looked at skin colour. They looked at facial features. They looked at geography. Then they built entire theories around what they thought they saw. The problem was that appearances can be deceptive. A lot of human history could be summarised as people being extremely confident about things they had absolutely no way of verifying. Then came genetics, and genetics ruined a great many popular assumptions. During the 20th century, scientists began uncovering the mechanisms of heredity. Later, the discovery of DNA provided an entirely new way to study humanity. For the first time, researchers could look beneath the skin itself. What they found was remarkable. No matter where people came from, their DNA was overwhelmingly similar. The differences that produced varying skin colours represented only a tiny fraction of the human genome. In fact, scientists discovered that all living humans share a surprisingly recent common ancestry. If you go back far enough, every person alive today traces their lineage to populations that lived in Africa. This finding revolutionized anthropology. It also created an awkward moment for many older racial theories. Because the evidence simply wasn't cooperating, genetic studies revealed that human populations have been mixing for thousands upon thousands of years. Ancient migrations left traces everywhere. Europeans carried ancestry from ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers from the Middle East, and steppe herders from Eurasia. South Asians showed evidence of multiple ancient migrations and mixtures. The peoples of the Americas carried ancestry linked to migrations from Asia. Across Africa itself, researchers found extraordinary genetic diversity, often greater than that found elsewhere in the world. The deeper scientists looked, the more complicated humanity became. and the more connected. One of the greatest surprises was discovering that human genetic variation does not divide neatly into racial categories. Instead, it resembles overlapping waves, gradual transitions, continuous mixtures. Nature had spent hundreds of thousands of years blending populations together. Humans had spent a few centuries pretending the opposite. DNA also revealed something humbling. Many populations that believed themselves isolated or unique turned out to share ancestors with groups thousands of miles away. Ancient travelers, traders, migrants, and conquerors had left genetic fingerprints across continents. History was literally written into our cells. By the beginning of the 21st century, the scientific picture had become increasingly clear. Human skin color was real. Human diversity was real. But humanity itself remained astonishingly unified. The traits that seemed so important on the surface represented only a small chapter in a much larger story. A story that began in Africa and eventually spread to every corner of the planet. And as DNA continued revealing the paths our ancestors had taken, one conclusion became harder and harder to ignore. The history of humanity was not a story of separation. It was a story of connection. By the time humanity had spread across the globe, adapted to different climates, and developed a wide range of skin tones, an outside observer might have concluded that different groups of humans were becoming fundamentally different from one another. Many people throughout history certainly reached that conclusion. The problem is that they were wrong, very wrong. In fact, modern genetics has revealed something that would probably surprise many of our ancestors. Humans are remarkably similar. A person from Nigeria, Norway, China, Peru, or Australia shares approximately 99.9% of their DNA with every other human being on Earth. Think about that for a moment. Entire empires were built on the assumption that human groups were radically different from one another. Wars were fought, laws were written, societies were divided, and all the while, humanity was arguing over a fraction of a percent. It's rather like spending centuries fighting over different paint colours on houses, while ignoring the fact that the houses themselves are almost identical. Skin colour, despite being one of the most noticeable human traits, is controlled by a relatively small number of genes. Those genes affect the amount and distribution of melanin in the skin. That's it. They do not determine intelligence. They do not determine character. They do not determine creativity. They do not determine courage. The sun was adjusting humanity's sunscreen settings, not creating separate versions of the species. Unfortunately, humans have always been experts at taking visible differences and assigning them enormous importance. Throughout history, people often assumed that what they could easily see must also be the most meaningful thing about someone. Biology disagrees. When scientists compare human populations, they often find more genetic variation within groups than between groups. Two people from the same region can sometimes be more genetically different from each other than either is from someone living on another continent. Nature once again refuses to fit neatly into human categories. This doesn't mean human populations don't have unique histories or adaptations. They absolutely do. The migrations, environments, and cultures that shaped different groups are real and fascinating. But those differences exist within a single human family, a very large family. A family that occasionally argues at holiday gatherings, invades neighbouring territories, and invents complicated theories about itself. Yet still one family. The deeper scientists look into our DNA, the clearer this becomes. All humans ultimately share common ancestors. All humans emerged from the same African origins, and all humans carry evidence of that shared history. The irony is almost perfect. The more science learns about humanity, the harder it becomes to divide humanity into separate biological boxes. Nature spent hundreds of thousands of years connecting us. Humans spent a few thousand years trying to draw lines through the middle of the picture. For most of human history, skin colour was simply an adaptation. It helped people survive in the environments where they lived. The sun influenced it. Geography influenced it. Migration influenced it. But eventually humans did what humans often do. They took a biological trait and turned it into a social one. Long before modern ideas about race emerged, many societies began attaching status and meaning to skin colour. Interestingly, these early attitudes were often very different from what people might expect today. In ancient Egypt, for example, artwork frequently depicted people using different skin tones. Men were often painted darker than women, partly because men spent more time working outdoors while women were associated with indoor activities. These artistic conventions reflected daily life rather than rigid racial categories. In ancient Greece and Rome, lighter skin often became associated with wealth and status. The reason was surprisingly simple. If your skin remained pale, it suggested you did not spend your days labouring under the sun. You had servants. You owned land. You possessed leisure. In other words, you were rich. A farmer working endless hours in the fields would naturally develop darker, sun-exposed skin. A wealthy aristocrat lounging indoors discussing philosophy, politics, or which neighbouring city deserved invading next could maintain a lighter complexion. The Roman elite even used cosmetics to make themselves appear paler. Some women applied powders containing lead to whiten their skin. This was not one of history's better beauty tips. The skin became lighter. The poisoning was less ideal. Across medieval Europe, similar attitudes persisted. Noble women avoided direct sunlight whenever possible. Pale skin became a visible sign that someone belonged to the upper classes rather than the agricultural workforce. The same pattern appeared in parts of Asia. In imperial China and later in Japan, pale skin often symbolized refinement and status. Wealthy families could afford lives spent indoors, while farmers worked under the open sky. The distinction was economic more than racial. It was not about ancestry, it was about occupation. The sun had unintentionally become a social marker. A tan often meant labour. Pale skin often meant privilege. Of course, this was deeply ironic. For hundreds of thousands of years, skin colour had evolved primarily because of environmental survival. Now societies were assigning entirely new meanings to it. Nature had created pigmentation to deal with ultraviolet radiation. Humans transformed it into a status symbol. And as trade networks expanded, empires grew, and distant populations encountered one another more frequently, these social ideas about skin colour would become increasingly complicated. Soon, pigmentation would become entangled with power, conquest, and identity. The biology would remain the same. The politics, however, were only getting started. For most of history, people certainly noticed differences in appearance. They noticed language differences, religious differences, cultural differences. They noticed clothing, hairstyles, accents, and customs. What they generally did not have was the modern concept of race. That idea emerged much later. Beginning in the late 15th century, European explorers, merchants, missionaries, and conquerors began travelling across the globe on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, populations that had been separated for thousands of years were encountering one another more frequently than ever before. Ships crossed oceans, empires expanded, trade routes connected continents, and humanity found itself meeting distant relatives it had not seen in a very long time. At first, many Europeans struggled to understand the incredible diversity they encountered. People looked different, spoke different languages, practiced different religions, lived in unfamiliar ways. The world suddenly seemed much larger than many had imagined. Unfortunately, curiosity was not the only thing travelling aboard those ships. So were greed, conquest, and ambition. As European colonial empires expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, governments and scholars increasingly sought ways to classify the populations they encountered. Humans love classification. We classify animals. We classify plants. We classify clouds. Given enough time, humans will attempt to classify absolutely anything, including themselves. By the 17th and 18th centuries, some European thinkers began dividing humanity into broad racial categories based largely on physical characteristics, such as skin colour. These classifications often claimed to be scientific. They were not, at least not by modern standards. Many were based on assumptions, cultural biases, and political interests, rather than rigorous evidence. Conveniently, these theories often place the people creating the classifications at the top. History contains a surprising number of systems in which the authors somehow conclude that they are the best example of humanity, an extraordinary coincidence. These racial theories became increasingly influential during the era of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Visible differences in skin colour were used to justify systems of exploitation, conquest, and inequality. Biological adaptations that had evolved because of sunlight and geography were suddenly being treated as evidence of deeper divisions between human beings. Yet the science behind these claims was remarkably weak. The people creating these categories had no understanding of genetics, no knowledge of DNA, no way of tracing humanity's shared origins. They were attempting to explain human diversity while missing many of the most important pieces of the puzzle. For centuries, these ideas shaped laws, societies, and empires. But as science advanced during the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers began uncovering evidence that challenged these assumptions. The more scientists learned about human biology, the less support they found for rigid racial divisions. Ironically, the very scientific methods used to create racial categories would eventually help dismantle them, and the next discoveries would completely transform our understanding of who we really are. For centuries, people argued about human differences using little more than observation. They looked at skin color, they looked at facial features, they looked at geography, then they built entire theories around what they thought they saw. The problem was that appearances can be deceptive. A lot of human history could be summarized as people being extremely confident about things they had absolutely no way of verifying. Then came genetics, and genetics ruined a great many popular assumptions. During the 20th century, scientists began uncovering the mechanisms of heredity. Later, the discovery of DNA provided an entirely new way to study humanity. For the first time, researchers could look beneath the skin itself. What they found was remarkable. No matter where people came from, their DNA was overwhelmingly similar. The differences that produced varying skin colors represented only a tiny fraction of the human genome. In fact, scientists discovered that all living humans share a surprisingly recent common ancestry. If you go back far enough, every person alive today traces their lineage to populations that lived in Africa. This finding revolutionized anthropology. It also created an awkward moment for many older racial theories. Because the evidence simply wasn't cooperating, genetic studies revealed that human populations have been mixing for thousands upon thousands of years. Ancient migrations left traces everywhere. Europeans carried ancestry from ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers from the Middle East, and steppe herders from Eurasia. South Asians showed evidence of multiple ancient migrations and mixtures. The peoples of the Americas carried ancestry linked to migrations from Asia. Across Africa itself, researchers found extraordinary genetic diversity, often greater than that found elsewhere in the world. The deeper scientists looked, the more complicated humanity became, and the more connected. One of the greatest surprises was discovering that human genetic variation does not divide neatly into racial categories. Instead, it resembles overlapping waves, gradual transitions, continuous mixtures. Nature had spent hundreds of thousands of years blending populations together. Humans had spent a few centuries pretending the opposite. DNA also revealed something humbling. Many populations that believed themselves isolated or unique turned out to share ancestors with groups thousands of miles away. Ancient travelers, traders, migrants, and conquerors had left genetic fingerprints across continents. History was literally written into our cells. By the beginning of the 21st century, the scientific picture had become increasingly clear. Human skin color was real. Human diversity was real. But humanity itself remained astonishingly unified. The traits that seemed so important on the surface represented only a small chapter in a much larger story. A story that began in Africa and eventually spread to every corner of the planet. And as DNA continued revealing the paths our ancestors had taken, one conclusion became harder and harder to ignore. The history of humanity was not a story of separation. It was a story of connection. For many girls who eventually entered the Ottoman Harem, the journey began in places that could not have felt more distant from the imperial capital. Small villages clung to mountain slopes in the Balkans. Farming communities dotted the valleys of Georgia and Circassia. Coastal towns overlooked the Black Sea. Few of these girls could have imagined that their lives would one day intersect with the center of one of the world's largest empires. Their paths to the palace varied enormously. Some were captured during wars and border conflicts. Others entered the slave trade that connected Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Middle East. A number were sold by impoverished families facing desperate circumstances. In certain regions, families even viewed placement within elite Ottoman households as a potential opportunity, hoping their daughters might receive education, security, or social advancement unavailable at home. The reality was usually more complicated. For a young girl, leaving home often meant saying goodbye to everything familiar. Family, language, customs, and childhood routines could disappear almost overnight. One day she might be helping with household chores or tending animals. A few weeks later, she could find herself travelling hundreds of miles toward a city she had never heard of. The slave markets that operated throughout parts of the Ottoman world were often the first major stop on this journey. Modern audiences tend to imagine chaotic scenes resembling adventure novels. In reality, many markets functioned under strict regulations. Buyers inspected health, age, physical condition, and skills. Merchants carefully documented transactions because healthy young women represented valuable investments. It sounds cold because it was. The girls themselves rarely had much control over the process. Their future often depended on decisions made by merchants, officials, military commanders, or family members. History tends to focus on emperors and grand battles, but countless lives were shaped by choices made in rooms where the people most affected had little voice at all. Yet not every destination was the same. Many girls purchased for ordinary households would spend their lives serving wealthy families. Only a small percentage ever reached the imperial palace. Those selected for the Sultan's household were considered exceptional prospects. Palace agents searched for intelligence, adaptability, and potential. By the time a recruit was chosen for service in the imperial harem, her journey had already transformed her life. But the most dramatic changes were still ahead. Far beyond the mountains, forests, and villages of her childhood stood Istanbul, the glittering capital of the Ottoman Empire, waiting at the end of the road. Once a girl had entered the networks that supplied elite Ottoman households, another group of people took over her future. The officials, merchants, brokers, and palace representatives who determined where she would ultimately be sent. This was not a random process. The Ottoman Empire was vast, stretching across 3 continents and governing millions of people. Maintaining the imperial household required organization on a remarkable scale. Topkapi Palace alone housed thousands of servants, administrators, guards, teachers, and attendants. The harem was only one part of this enormous machine, but it required a steady flow of new recruits. Merchants often acted as the first link in the chain. Experienced traders travelled established routes connecting the Balkans, Crimea, the Caucasus, and the Ottoman heartland. They knew which regions were known for producing healthy and educated girls. They understood local customs, languages, and political conditions. Most importantly, they knew what elite Ottoman buyers were seeking. When promising recruits were identified, information travelled quickly. A wealthy governor might request attendance for his household. A powerful official could seek educated young women for domestic service. Palace representatives sometimes received reports about particularly desirable candidates. In an empire where news travelled on horseback, reputation could move surprisingly fast. The most promising girls were often examined repeatedly before being approved for palace service. Health was a major concern. Palace physicians wanted recruits who appeared physically strong and free from obvious illnesses. Officials also paid attention to behaviour. Was she respectful? Did she learn quickly? Could she remain calm under pressure? These qualities mattered because palace life demanded strict discipline. A beautiful face might attract attention, but beauty alone rarely guaranteed success. The imperial court valued intelligence. Girls entering the palace would spend years learning languages, etiquette, religion, music, literature, and court customs. Officials wanted recruits capable of handling this education. Investing years of training into someone who refused to learn was about as appealing as buying an expensive horse that preferred sleeping to walking. Documentation followed many transactions. Records tracked ownership, transfers, and legal status. The Ottoman bureaucracy loved paperwork almost as much as modern governments do. Somewhere, an exhausted clerk was probably complaining about forms while unknowingly helping shape imperial history. By the time a recruit received approval for transfer to the imperial household, numerous people had already evaluated her potential. Merchants had noticed her. Brokers had negotiated her transfer. Officials had reviewed her suitability. Now only one step remained. The road to Istanbul awaited, carrying her away from the world she knew and toward the heart of the Ottoman Empire. After being selected for palace service, a recruit's life entered its most uncertain phase. The inspections were finished. The negotiations were complete. The officials had made their decisions. Now came the long journey to Istanbul, a city so enormous and famous that many girls had only heard of it through rumours and stories. For some recruits, the trip lasted weeks. For others, it could take months. A girl from the Balkans might travel by horse-drawn wagon along dusty roads that wound through forests and mountains. A recruit from the Caucasus often faced an even longer route, crossing rugged terrain before reaching ports on the Black Sea. From there, ships carried passengers toward the Ottoman capital. Travel in the early modern world was rarely comfortable. Roads were muddy in spring, scorching in summer, and nearly impassable during harsh winters. Travellers dealt with storms, disease, bandits, broken wagons, and exhausted animals. Inns varied from respectable establishments to places where the bedbugs seemed to own the property. For young girls making the journey, the emotional burden was often even greater than the physical one. Many had left behind parents, siblings, friends, and familiar surroundings. Languages changed as they moved from region to region. Foods became unfamiliar. Clothing styles shifted. Religious buildings looked different. Entire landscapes transformed before their eyes. With every mile travelled, home seemed farther away. Some recruits travelled in groups under the supervision of trusted escorts. This reduced the risks of theft or escape and ensured that valuable recruits arrived safely at their destination. Wealthy buyers and palace officials had little interest in losing their investments somewhere along a mountain road because an escort decided to take an unscheduled nap. As the travellers approached Istanbul, stories about the city grew increasingly dramatic. People described towering walls that stretched for miles. They spoke of crowded markets filled with goods from 3 continents. They told tales of grand mosques, imperial ceremonies, and ships covering the waters of the Bosporus like floating forests. Surprisingly, many of those stories were not exaggerations. When recruits finally caught their first glimpse of the capital, they encountered one of the largest cities in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within its neighbourhoods. Merchants, sailors, scholars, soldiers, diplomats, and pilgrims filled its streets. For girls arriving from remote villages, the sight could be overwhelming, but the journey was not truly over yet. Beyond the city walls stood Topkapi Palace, where a completely new life was about to begin. The empire had brought them to its capital. Now it would begin transforming them into members of the imperial household. The moment a recruit entered Istanbul, she had technically reached her destination. In reality, however, the most important part of her journey was only beginning. Before entering the imperial harem, newly arrived girls underwent a series of examinations and registrations. Palace officials wanted detailed records of every recruit who entered the household. Names, ages, origins, physical condition, and legal status were carefully documented. The Ottoman Empire loved organisation, and Topkapi Palace functioned with the efficiency of a small city. For many recruits, the first days were filled with confusion. They found themselves surrounded by unfamiliar languages, customs, and faces. Girls from different regions of Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Middle East suddenly lived side by side. Some spoke Turkish. Many did not. Communication often relied on gestures, patient instruction, and a great deal of trial and error. Medical inspections followed. Palace physicians examined recruits to ensure they were healthy enough for service. This was not simply a matter of appearance. The imperial household invested heavily in training its members, and officials wanted to avoid future problems. A recruit who demonstrated good health and strong potential represented a valuable addition to the palace. After registration came another major change: clothing. The simple garments many girls had worn during their journey were replaced with attire appropriate for palace life. For some recruits, it was the finest clothing they had ever touched. Rich fabrics, carefully tailored garments, and proper court dress immediately signalled that they had entered a very different world. Yet luxury came with rules. Every movement inside the palace followed strict protocols. There were schedules for meals, lessons, prayers, and work assignments. Senior women supervised younger recruits. Respect for rank was expected at all times. A newcomer quickly learned that the palace was not a place where one could simply wander around exploring hallways out of curiosity. The harem itself was far larger and more complex than outsiders imagined. Rather than a collection of lavish rooms devoted solely to pleasure, it functioned as a highly organised institution. Hundreds of women lived there, performing countless duties that kept the imperial household running. Education, administration, service, and discipline occupied much of daily life. As recruits settled into their new surroundings, the reality of palace life slowly became clear. The difficult journey was over. The uncertainty of arrival had passed. Now they faced an even greater challenge. They had entered one of the most powerful households in the world, and everything from their language to their manners would need to be learned anew. The transformation from village girl to palace woman was about to begin. Once a recruit had settled into the palace, her real education began. The Ottoman court did not simply collect young girls and leave them to figure things out on their own. The imperial harem operated as one of the most sophisticated educational institutions in the empire. Its purpose was to transform recruits from vastly different backgrounds into polished members of the imperial household. For many girls, this process lasted years. The first challenge was language. Turkish served as the primary language of the palace, and newcomers were expected to learn it as quickly as possible. A girl arriving from Bosnia, Georgia, Albania, Greece, or Circassia might initially understand almost nothing spoken around her. Before long, however, lessons filled her daily schedule. Learning Turkish was only the beginning. Recruits received instruction in religion, reading, writing, court etiquette, and proper behaviour. They learned how to walk, speak, and present themselves according to palace standards. Even small details mattered. The imperial court believed refinement could be taught, and its teachers devoted enormous effort to proving it. Music formed another important part of education. Girls with talent might study singing, poetry, dancing, or the playing of musical instruments. Others specialized in embroidery, sewing, textile production, or household management. The palace needed a wide variety of skills, and every recruit was encouraged to develop abilities that would make her useful within the imperial system. The schedule was demanding. Days began early and followed strict routines. Lessons, work assignments, prayers, meals, and supervised activities filled the hours. Idleness was discouraged. The palace had invested significant resources in every recruit and expected results. Fortunately for the instructors, most girls quickly realized that learning offered opportunities. Advancement within the harem depended heavily on ability. A clever student could attract the attention of senior women responsible for managing the institution. Demonstrating discipline, intelligence, and reliability often opened doors to better positions and greater responsibilities. Not every recruit adjusted easily. Some struggled with homesickness. Others found the rules overwhelming. Imagine being told that nearly every aspect of your day, from your clothing to your conversation, was subject to supervision. Modern teenagers would likely organize a rebellion before lunch, yet many girls adapted remarkably well. As months turned into years, they formed friendships, learned new skills, and gradually became part of the palace community. The frightened newcomers who had once arrived from distant villages slowly disappeared. In their place emerged educated young women shaped by one of the most demanding training systems in the Ottoman Empire. Soon, they would discover where they truly fit within the complicated hierarchy of the imperial harem. By the time a recruit completed her initial education, she had learned an important lesson about life inside the imperial harem. Not everyone was equal. The harem operated according to a strict hierarchy. Every woman had a rank. Every rank carried responsibilities, and every responsibility came with expectations. Understanding one's place within this system was essential for survival. At the bottom stood the newest recruits. These young women performed basic duties while continuing their education. They cleaned, assisted senior attendants, learned palace customs, and proved their reliability. Their lives were closely supervised, and mistakes were noticed quickly. When most people imagine the Mongols, they picture horsemen thundering across endless grasslands, sleeping in tents, and conquering cities before riding off to conquer the next one. And to be fair, the Mongols worked very hard to create that reputation. But by the time Kublai Khan ruled the empire in the late 13th century, things had changed dramatically. This was no longer the age of constant movement. The grandson of Genghis Khan had inherited the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. Managing such a vast realm from horseback was becoming increasingly impractical. Even Mongol horses have limits, especially when asked to supervise tax collection thousands of miles away. So Kublai did something that would have surprised many of his ancestors. He built a capital. The city became known as Khanbalik, near modern Beijing, to foreign visitors arriving from Europe, the scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Massive walls surrounded districts packed with officials, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, and servants. Wide avenues stretched across the city. Markets overflowed with goods arriving from every corner of Asia. Marco Polo would later describe a metropolis unlike anything he had ever seen. Whether every detail he reported was accurate remains a matter of debate. Marco occasionally displayed the storytelling habits of a man who understood that extraordinary tales attract attention. Nevertheless, even allowing for exaggeration, Khanbalik was one of the greatest cities on earth. At its centre stood the imperial palace. The complex was enormous. Great halls, courtyards, gardens, administrative buildings, and private residences spread across a vast area. Golden decorations glittered in the sunlight. Silk banners moved gently in the wind. Guards stood watch everywhere, and there were many guards. An empire created through conquest tends to develop trust issues. Thousands of officials worked within the capital. Messengers constantly arrived carrying reports from distant provinces. Diplomats from foreign kingdoms waited for audiences. Merchants sought trading privileges. Generals requested instructions. Priests, scholars, engineers, and administrators all competed for the attention of the great Khan. The result was a court unlike any other in history. Nomadic traditions mixed with Chinese bureaucracy. Mongol warriors shared corridors with Confucian scholars. Persian astronomers worked alongside Chinese engineers. Languages from across Eurasia echoed through the palace halls. For a visitor entering the city for the first time, the experience must have felt overwhelming. This was not merely a capital. It was the command centre of half the known world, ruled by a man whose authority stretched farther than most people could imagine. And beyond the palace gates waited even greater wonders. If Khanbalik impressed visitors, the imperial palace left them nearly speechless. After passing through the crowded streets of the capital, a visitor approaching the residence of Kublai Khan encountered layer after layer of security. Massive gates controlled access to the complex. Armed guards stood at every entrance. Officials checked credentials, announced arrivals, and ensured that nobody wandered where they were not supposed to be. The Mongol Empire ruled millions of people. Its ruler was not accepting unexpected visitors. Marco Polo described a palace so large and magnificent that many Europeans simply struggled to believe him. Vast halls stretched across the complex. White stone, lacquered wood, silk decorations, and gold ornaments reflected wealth on a scale rarely seen in medieval Europe. And this was only the visible part. Behind the ceremonial spaces existed an entire city dedicated to serving the court. Kitchens, storage facilities, barracks, stables, workshops, offices, and living quarters supported the daily operation of the imperial household. Thousands of people worked behind the scenes to ensure everything functioned smoothly. The logistics alone were staggering. Every day, enormous quantities of food entered the palace. Horses required feeding. Servants needed housing. Officials demanded supplies. Guests expected hospitality. Maintaining the court of the great Khan required resources that could have supported entire towns elsewhere. Visitors entering the main audience halls encountered a carefully designed display of power. Everything emphasized the ruler's importance. The ceilings rose high overhead. Columns stretched toward the roof. Rich fabrics covered walls and furniture. Precious objects from across Asia decorated the rooms. The message was clear. This was not merely a king. This was the ruler of the largest empire in the world. Even approaching Kublai required following strict rules. Officials instructed visitors where to stand, when to bow, and how to address the emperor. Court ceremonies operated with remarkable precision. A misplaced gesture or breach of etiquette could create embarrassment for both the visitor and the officials responsible for supervising them. Fortunately, most guests preferred not to test the patience of a man whose armies had conquered half a continent. Foreign ambassadors often found the experience intimidating. They came from kingdoms that suddenly seemed quite small compared to the empire surrounding them. Many spent days rehearsing protocols before appearing before the great Khan. Yet, despite all the grandeur, the palace was more than a monument to power. It was a working government headquarters where decisions affecting millions of people were made every day. Generals discussed military campaigns. Tax officials managed revenue. Advisors debated policy. At the centre of it all sat Kublai Khan himself, overseeing an empire that stretched farther than any ruler before him had ever controlled. The question was how exactly he managed such an enormous responsibility day after day. For a man who ruled the largest empire on earth, Kublai Khan's day was surprisingly busy. This may sound obvious, but it is worth remembering. Popular imagination often portrays emperors spending their time lounging on golden thrones, while servants wave fans and musicians provide background entertainment. Kublai certainly enjoyed luxury, but he also had an empire to run. And empires, unfortunately, generate paperwork. Lots of paperwork. Each morning, reports arrived from every corner of his realm. Officials brought updates from China, Mongolia, Korea, Tibet, Central Asia, and distant provinces stretching thousands of miles from the capital. Military commanders reported on border security. Tax collectors detailed revenues. Governors explained local problems. Diplomats delivered messages from foreign rulers. The Great Khan was expected to know about all of it. Court sessions occupied a significant portion of his day. Ministers, advisors, scholars, and generals gathered to discuss policies and present recommendations. Kublai listened, questioned, and made decisions that could affect millions of subjects. Unlike many of his nomadic ancestors, Kublai embraced administration. He understood that conquering an empire and governing one were entirely different challenges. Winning a battle might take a day. Managing a province could take decades. When official business ended, other responsibilities began. The Khan regularly received foreign visitors. Ambassadors from distant kingdoms travelled enormous distances seeking trade agreements, alliances, or simply the honour of appearing before the most powerful ruler in the world. These meetings were carefully choreographed displays of authority. Every visitor left understanding who held the stronger position. Hunting also played an important role in Kublai's life. The Mongols viewed hunting as more than recreation. It served as military training, leadership practice, and cultural tradition. Massive hunting expeditions involved thousands of participants. Riders spread across vast areas while trained birds, dogs, and hunters worked together to drive animals toward designated zones. The scale was extraordinary. A European noble might organize a hunting party. Kublai organized something closer to a military operation that happened to involve deer. Meals punctuated the day as well. Banquets brought together officials, nobles, military leaders, and guests. Important discussions often continued during feasts, blending politics with entertainment. In the Mongol court, eating and governing frequently occurred side by side. Despite the luxury surrounding him, Kublai rarely escaped responsibility. Every decision carried consequences across an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean deep into Asia. Every appointment, military order, or tax policy affected countless lives. Yet maintaining such authority required more than administration alone. The court constantly staged displays of wealth and power designed to impress both subjects and visitors. And nowhere was that more evident than during the spectacular feasts of the Great Khan. If the palace demonstrated Kublai Khan's power, the imperial banquets demonstrated its wealth. Visitors who attended one of the Great Khan's feasts often struggled to describe what they witnessed. Everything was designed to overwhelm the senses. The food, the decorations, the music, the ceremonies, and the sheer number of guests all communicated the same message. The ruler of the Mongol Empire possessed resources beyond ordinary comprehension. And unlike some rulers who preferred modest displays, Kublai was perfectly comfortable making that point repeatedly. The banquet halls themselves were impressive enough. Long tables stretched across enormous chambers. Rich silks covered walls and furnishings. Golden vessels, silver cups, and finely crafted decorations reflected the light from countless lamps and candles. Officials, nobles, military commanders, foreign ambassadors, and honoured guests filled the room according to strict seating arrangements. Where a person sat mattered very much. The closer someone sat to the Great Khan, the greater their status. Entire political careers could be advanced or damaged by seating arrangements. Human beings, it turns out, have always been remarkably sensitive about who gets the better chair. Then came the food. According to Marco Polo and other accounts, vast quantities of meat appeared at imperial banquets. Lamb, venison, game birds, and other delicacies were prepared by teams of cooks serving the enormous court. Dishes arrived continuously throughout the feast. And because this was the court of Kublai Khan, Moderation was not a major theme. Food arrived from every region of the empire. Trade routes connected China, Central Asia, Persia, and countless other territories. Exotic spices, fruits, wines, and luxury ingredients flowed into the capital from thousands of miles away. The drinks received equal attention. Wine, fermented mare's milk, and other beverages circulated throughout the gathering. Servants moved constantly between tables, ensuring guests never lacked refreshments. Yet the feast was not simply about eating. Entertainment played a central role. Musicians performed. Dancers appeared. Acrobats demonstrated astonishing skills. Storytellers, performers, and entertainers from across Eurasia showcased talents gathered from the far corners of the empire. Foreign visitors watched in amazement. Many had never seen such diversity in a single location. Chinese performers entertained Persian merchants. Mongol nobles dined alongside diplomats from distant kingdoms. Languages from half the known world filled the air. Most importantly, every banquet reinforced Kublai's authority. Guests left impressed not only by the luxury but by what it represented. Feeding thousands of people, organizing elaborate ceremonies, and gathering talent from across continents required immense power. And while the men dominated the public ceremonies, another important world existed behind the scenes. The vast household of women who helped shape daily life within the court itself. Behind the grand audience halls, military councils, and extravagant banquets existed another world that most foreign visitors rarely saw directly. It was the world of the imperial household. Like many rulers throughout history, Kublai Khan maintained a large court of wives, consorts, attendants, servants, and female relatives. To outsiders, this part of the palace often appeared mysterious. Stories circulated constantly, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some were true, others became increasingly creative as they travelled across continents. The reality was impressive enough without embellishment. The household of the great Khan was enormous. Kublai's principal wife, known as the Chief Empress, occupied the highest position among the women of the court. She managed a vast household and possessed considerable influence. In Mongol tradition, senior women often exercised far more authority than many foreign observers expected. This surprised visitors from societies where royal women were frequently kept away from political affairs. The Mongols had different traditions. From the days of Genghis Khan onward, powerful women played important roles in governing territories, managing resources, overseeing diplomacy, and maintaining family alliances. Several Mongol empresses and noblewomen had effectively ruled parts of the empire during periods of transition. Kublai's court continued this pattern. Below the chief empress stood other wives and consorts, each with her own residence, servants, and staff. According to various accounts, the Khan maintained multiple households within the palace complex. These were not simply personal residences, but highly organized communities requiring extensive administration. Every household functioned almost like a small court. Servants prepared meals. Attendants managed clothing and daily needs. Officials handled records and supplies. Guards protected the residents. The scale of organization was extraordinary. Children also occupied an important place within palace life. The imperial family was large, and educating future princes and princesses required significant resources. Tutors, scholars, religious leaders, and advisors all participated in preparing the next generation of the ruling dynasty. For ambitious nobles, family connections mattered enormously. Marriage alliances helped secure loyalty across the empire. Powerful families sought connections with the ruling house, knowing that even distant ties to the great Khan could bring prestige and opportunity. Despite the luxury surrounding them, life within the imperial household was governed by strict rules and expectations. Rank determined privileges, protocol dictated behavior, relationships required careful management. The palace might have glittered with wealth, but it remained a place where every action carried consequences. To foreign visitors, some of the customs governing this world seemed unusual, even strange. And as Marco Polo discovered, the court of Kublai Khan possessed no shortage of ceremonies and traditions capable of astonishing even the most well-travelled observer. To a traveller arriving from Europe, the court of Kublai Khan often felt like stepping into another world. The wealth was astonishing enough, but it was the customs and ceremonies that truly captured attention. Every court in history developed rituals to emphasize power and authority. The Mongol court simply did so on a scale large enough to make ordinary royal ceremonies look like a village council meeting. One of the first things foreign visitors noticed was the strict etiquette surrounding the Great Khan. Approaching the ruler required careful attention to protocol. Guests could not simply walk up and start a conversation. Specific rules governed where people stood, when they moved, and how they addressed the emperor. Court officials monitored every detail to ensure ceremonies unfolded smoothly. These rituals served a purpose. Kublai ruled an empire composed of dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures. Ceremonies helped create a sense of order, and reinforced the idea that all authority ultimately flowed from the Great Khan. Religious customs fascinated visitors as well. Unlike many rulers of the medieval world, Kublai generally tolerated a wide range of faiths. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, and followers of traditional Mongol beliefs all lived within the empire. Religious leaders frequently appeared at court, sometimes debating theology before imperial audiences. To European observers, this diversity could seem almost unbelievable. In an age when many kingdoms fought bitterly over religion, Kublai often preferred to welcome different faiths rather than exclude them. His primary concern was usually loyalty to the empire rather than strict religious conformity. Certain ceremonies reflected older Mongol traditions. The Mongols retained deep respect for the natural world and their nomadic heritage. Hunting rituals, seasonal celebrations, and military gatherings all carried symbolic importance. Even as Kublai governed from magnificent palaces, he remained connected to customs that had originated on the open steppe. Some traditions struck foreigners as particularly unusual. Marco Polo described elaborate celebrations, special audiences, and carefully organized public events involving thousands of participants. Whether every detail was perfectly accurate is impossible to know, but the overall picture is clear. The court loved spectacle, and spectacle was useful. A ruler who controlled half the known world benefited from reminding people of that fact whenever possible. Even everyday objects could become part of these displays. Precious gifts arrived from distant provinces. Exotic animals appeared as tribute. Rare goods from across Asia filled palace storerooms. The ceremonies impressed visitors, but they also revealed something deeper. The court of Kublai Khan was not merely wealthy. It sat at the center of a vast network connecting cultures, religions, and trade routes across Eurasia, and nowhere was that connection more visible than in the incredible riches flowing into the empire from every direction. The court of Kublai Khan was not simply rich. It was connected to one of the largest trading networks the world had ever seen. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched across enormous distances, linking lands that had previously operated largely independent of one another. Merchants could travel farther and more safely than before. Goods moved across deserts, mountains, grasslands, and seas. As a result, wealth poured into the Great Khan's capital from every direction. The palace became a showcase of this global network. Silks arrived from the workshops of China. Precious stones came from distant mountains. Fine textiles travelled from Persia. Exotic spices crossed deserts and oceans. Rare woods, ivory, perfumes, ceramics, and luxury goods appeared in the capital from regions most Europeans had never even heard of. To foreign visitors, it seemed as though the entire world was sending gifts to Kublai Khan. In many cases, that was not far from the truth. Tribute missions regularly arrived at court carrying valuable presents. Some rulers offered gifts to secure favourable relations. Others hoped to gain trading privileges. A few simply wished to avoid giving the impression that they were unfriendly toward the ruler whose armies had conquered much of Eurasia. History occasionally demonstrates that diplomacy is cheaper than war. The palace storerooms reflected this constant flow of wealth. Officials carefully recorded valuable items entering imperial possession. Warehouses contained food reserves, luxury goods, weapons, textiles, and precious metals. The administration needed detailed records because managing the resources of such a vast empire required organization on a staggering scale. Paper money also amazed foreign visitors. While many parts of Europe still relied heavily on coins made from precious metals, Kublai's government used paper currency extensively. Marco Polo described the system with fascination, explaining how paper backed by imperial authority circulated throughout much of the empire. To many Europeans, the concept sounded absurd. The idea that a ruler could turn paper into money seemed suspiciously close to magic. Yet the system worked remarkably well for long periods, helping facilitate trade across enormous distances. The wealth visible at court reflected more than luxury. It demonstrated the empire's reach. Every silk robe, jewelled ornament, exotic animal, and tribute gift represented connections stretching thousands of miles. The Great Khan's court stood at the centre of an economic web linking China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. But all this prosperity depended on one thing above all else. The empire needed to remain stable. Maintaining control over such vast territories required armies, governors, laws, and constant vigilance. Behind the glittering wealth and endless ceremonies stood the immense challenge of holding together the largest land empire in human history. From the outside, the Mongol Empire looked unstoppable. Its armies had conquered kingdoms, destroyed rival dynasties, and expanded across continents. Under Kublai Khan, the empire controlled more territory than any ruler before him. To visitors arriving at the imperial court, it must have seemed as though the Great Khan possessed unlimited power. The reality was more complicated. Conquering an empire was difficult. Keeping it together was even harder. The territories under Kublai's authority stretched across mountains, deserts, forests, rivers, and vast open grasslands. Messages could take weeks or even months to travel from one end of the empire to another. A rebellion, famine, invasion, or political crisis could emerge thousands of miles away before news ever reached the capital. To manage this challenge, Kublai relied on a massive administrative system. Governors oversaw provinces, tax officials collected revenue, military commanders secured borders, judges enforced laws. Couriers carried information across the empire using an impressive relay network of stations and fresh horses. This communication system became one of the empire's greatest strengths. Messengers could travel with remarkable speed compared to most medieval states. Important information moved across vast distances far more efficiently than many foreign observers believed possible. Even so, problems constantly emerged. Some Mongol nobles disliked Kublai's growing reliance on Chinese-style administration. Traditionalists worried that the empire's rulers were becoming too settled and too comfortable. Their ancestors had conquered the world from horseback, not from palace offices filled with clerks. Others questioned Kublai's focus on governing China. After all, he had officially declared himself Emperor of China while also remaining Great Khan of the Mongols. Balancing these two identities was never easy. What benefited Chinese officials did not always please Mongol nobles. Then there were the military challenges. Although the empire remained powerful, enemies still existed. Border conflicts required attention. Rival states tested defences. Rebellions occasionally erupted in distant regions. Maintaining peace demanded constant vigilance, and all of this depended on one man. Every major decision eventually flowed through Kublai Khan. Appointments, military campaigns, tax policies, diplomatic agreements, and legal reforms all required his approval. The empire's stability rested heavily upon his ability to manage competing interests and prevent the vast machine from falling apart. Remarkably, he succeeded for decades, yet no ruler lives forever. As Kublai grew older, questions about succession began to loom over the court. Behind the magnificent palaces and endless ceremonies, powerful figures quietly wondered what would happen when the Great Khan was gone. Because history had shown many times that building an empire was one challenge, surviving the death of its ruler was another entirely. For decades, Kublai Khan stood at the center of the most powerful empire on earth. Foreign ambassadors traveled thousands of miles to seek his favor. Merchants crossed continents under the protection of Mongol rule. Generals commanded armies from Korea to Central Asia. His capital glittered with wealth, and his authority seemed unshakable. But even the greatest rulers cannot defeat time. By the final years of his reign, the aging conqueror faced challenges very different from the ones that had defined his youth. The energetic leader who had expanded and organized the empire began to experience personal losses. Several of his closest family members died before him, including individuals he had hoped would continue his legacy. These deaths weighed heavily on the aging emperor. The court remained magnificent. The ceremonies continued. The banquets still dazzled visitors. Yet beneath the splendor, uncertainty was growing. Succession had always been a dangerous issue within the Mongol world. The empire built by Genghis Khan had already experienced divisions among competing branches of the royal family. Powerful princes governed distant territories, and their interests did not always align with those of the great Khan in Khanbalik. Kublai understood the danger. The larger an empire became, the harder it was to keep united. Even during his lifetime, parts of the Mongol world had begun drifting apart. The great khanates that stretched across Eurasia increasingly pursued their own goals. While they still shared a common heritage, they no longer functioned as a single, perfectly unified state. Meanwhile, Kublai's health gradually declined. The ruler, who had once led campaigns and travelled extensively, spent more time within the palace. Advisors and officials assumed greater responsibilities. Court politics became increasingly focused on the future rather than the present. Everyone understood the question nobody wished to ask openly: what would happen after Kublai Khan died? When that moment finally came in the year 1294, the world lost one of its most remarkable rulers. He had transformed a nomadic empire into a sophisticated imperial state. He had conquered China, established a new dynasty, and presided over an era of unprecedented connections between East and West. Yet his death also revealed a harsh reality. The empire depended heavily on his leadership. His successors inherited extraordinary wealth, vast territories, and powerful institutions. They also inherited every problem that came with governing them. The magnificent court described by Marco Polo did not disappear overnight, but its greatest days were already passing. Kublai Khan had built one of history's most extraordinary courts, a place where Mongol warriors, Chinese scholars, Persian merchants, and European travellers all crossed paths. For a brief moment, the centre of the world seemed to exist within his palace walls, and few visitors ever forgot what they had seen there. A samurai's training did not begin with a sword. It began with a name. The moment a child was born into a samurai family in medieval Japan, expectations settled upon him like an invisible suit of armour. He had not yet learned to walk. He could not ride a horse. He certainly could not swing a sword without accidentally injuring himself, a nearby servant, or possibly a piece of expensive furniture. Yet his future had already been mapped out. He was expected to serve. Unlike peasants, merchants, or craftsmen, samurai families belonged to the warrior class. Their position brought privileges, but it also brought obligations. A samurai existed to serve his lord, protect his family's honour, and uphold a code of conduct that valued loyalty above almost everything else. That sounds noble. It also meant childhood came with considerably fewer excuses than most children would have preferred. From an early age, boys were reminded that they represented their entire family. Every action reflected upon parents, grandparents, and ancestors. A careless mistake was rarely just a personal mistake. It became a family matter. No pressure. The household itself reinforced these lessons. A samurai child grew up surrounded by symbols of military service. Swords hung on walls. Armor was carefully maintained. Stories of ancestors filled conversations. Relatives spoke about loyalty, duty, courage, and sacrifice as naturally as other families discussed the weather. Sometimes these stories were inspiring. Sometimes they were thinly disguised warnings. A grandfather might describe an ancestor who earned great honour through bravery. He might also mention another relative who embarrassed the family and whose name was quietly forgotten. Children learned very quickly which example they were expected to follow. Education began early. Parents taught proper manners, respect for elders, and self-discipline. A samurai child was expected to bow correctly, speak politely, and control his emotions. Losing one's temper was viewed as weakness. Complaining accomplished little. Excuses accomplished even less. The ideal samurai was calm, disciplined, and reliable. Naturally, most children were none of those things. They were still children. They played games, chased each other through courtyards, argued with siblings, and occasionally ignored instructions. The difference was that every childish mistake became an opportunity for another lesson in discipline. As the years passed, those lessons intensified. The carefree years of early childhood would soon give way to formal training. Books, etiquette, weapons, and martial exercises awaited. The path toward becoming a samurai was only beginning, and the first challenge was learning that before a warrior could master a sword, he first had to learn how to master himself. Long before a samurai child was trusted with a weapon, he was expected to master something far more difficult: sitting still. This may not sound impressive, but to a 7-year-old boy with unlimited energy and questionable decision-making abilities, it was a challenge worthy of legendary status. A samurai's education began with discipline rather than combat. Parents and instructors understood that a warrior who could not control himself would eventually become a danger to everyone around him, including himself. Before learning how to defeat an enemy, a child first had to learn obedience, patience, and self-control. His day often started early, very early. The medieval world had little interest in letting children sleep until noon. Morning lessons began with proper greetings, household duties, and instruction from parents or tutors. Respect for elders was constantly reinforced. Every bow had to be performed correctly. Every conversation required proper etiquette. Mistakes were corrected immediately and repeatedly, and sometimes repeatedly after being corrected repeatedly. Reading and writing formed an important part of a samurai child's education. Contrary to popular imagination, samurai were not simply warriors swinging swords across battlefields all day. Many served as administrators, officials, and advisors. Literacy became increasingly important, especially during long periods of peace. A boy might spend hours copying characters with a brush. His handwriting mattered. His posture mattered. The way he held the brush mattered. In many cases, it probably felt as though everything mattered. Because it did. Teachers believed small habits revealed larger character traits. A sloppy student might become a careless official. A careless official could become a failed samurai. At least that was the theory. Moral lessons occupied just as much attention. Stories of loyalty, honor, courage, and sacrifice filled a child's education. Historical heroes were praised. Traitors were condemned. Young boys learned which virtues society admired and which behaviors brought shame. Not surprisingly, many of these lessons focused on duty. A samurai was expected to place obligations before personal desires. This idea appeared again and again throughout childhood. Whether the lesson involved studying, household responsibilities, or proper conduct, the message remained the same. Your duty comes first. Only after proving maturity would a child begin formal martial training. Even then, real weapons remained largely out of reach. Adults understood something that history has repeatedly confirmed. Giving sharp swords to unsupervised children is generally a poor strategy. For now, lessons continued. The future warrior spent his days learning patience, discipline, literacy, and self-control. It was not the exciting life described in heroic legends, but it laid the foundation for everything that followed. Soon enough, the wooden training swords would appear, and childhood would become considerably more painful. Eventually, every samurai child reached the moment he had been waiting for. The day someone finally handed him a sword. Well, not a real sword. The adults were strict, but they were not completely insane. Instead, young boys received wooden training weapons, known as bokken. These looked enough like real swords to feel exciting and dangerous. More importantly, they hurt plenty when swung incorrectly, which turned out to be an effective teaching tool, and they were swung incorrectly, frequently. The romantic image of a young samurai effortlessly mastering swordsmanship belongs mostly to modern films. The reality involved missed strikes, clumsy footwork, bruised fingers, sore muscles, and a constant stream of corrections from instructors who possessed very little patience for excuses. Training often began with the basics: how to stand, how to bow, how to hold the sword, how to draw it, how to return it to its scabbard. A student might spend days practicing movements without ever striking a target. This could be frustrating for energetic boys who wanted immediate action. Unfortunately for them, their instructors believed that mastering fundamentals mattered more than looking impressive. The instructors were correct, though children rarely appreciated hearing that. Swordsmanship was only one part of training. Archery held enormous importance within samurai culture. In fact, early samurai often viewed themselves as mounted archers first and swordsmen second. Young boys learned how to handle bows, judge distances, and develop concentration. Hitting a target consistently required patience and discipline. The target, unfortunately, did not care how hard a student had practiced. It either got hit or it did not. Physical conditioning accompanied martial instruction. Running, climbing, balancing exercises, and various drills helped prepare boys for the demands of military life. While modern children might complain about sports practice, a A samurai child had little hope of convincing his instructor that he was just not feeling it today. The answer would likely have been laughter, or more training, sometimes both. Competition naturally developed among students. Boys compared skills, challenged one another, and measured their progress against friends and siblings. Victories brought pride. Defeats brought valuable lessons, usually painful lessons, yet beneath all the physical training lay a deeper purpose. The goal was not simply to create skilled fighters. The goal was to create disciplined warriors capable of remaining calm under pressure. Every drill, every correction, and every bruise reinforced that lesson. As the years passed, wooden swords became familiar companions. The child who had once struggled to hold a training weapon properly slowly began developing confidence. Soon, however, another challenge awaited him. A samurai was not expected to fight only on foot. To become a true warrior, he would need to master one of the most important skills in all of Japanese warfare: riding a horse. By the time a samurai boy had spent years practicing with wooden swords and bows, another challenge awaited him. It was larger, heavier, and possessed strong opinions about whether it wished to cooperate. The horse. In samurai society, horsemanship was not an optional skill. For centuries, Japanese warriors fought primarily as mounted archers. A samurai who could not ride was like a sailor who feared water or a fisherman who disliked fish. Technically possible, but not a promising career path. Training began cautiously. Young boys were first introduced to calm, experienced horses. The goal was to build confidence rather than create dramatic stories involving emergency medical treatment. Students learned how to approach a horse, lead it, groom it, and understand its behavior. This was important because horses are not swords. A sword generally stays where you leave it. A horse makes its own decisions, sometimes very poor decisions. The first riding lessons focused on balance and control. Students practiced mounting and dismounting repeatedly. They learned how to sit properly in the saddle and guide the animal using reins and body movement. At first, many boys bounced awkwardly with every step, looking less like future warriors and more like sacks of rice being transported across the countryside. Their instructors noticed. Their instructors always noticed. As confidence improved, the training became more demanding. Students learned to ride at faster speeds, navigate difficult terrain, and maintain control while carrying weapons. Balance became crucial. A warrior who fell from his horse during battle would likely have a very short and unpleasant military career. Archery soon returned to the curriculum, only now it became much more difficult. Hitting a target while standing still was challenging enough. Hitting one while riding a moving horse required extraordinary coordination. Young samurai practiced endlessly, learning to draw, aim, and release arrows while maintaining control of both themselves and their mounts. The skill demanded patience. It also demanded accepting failure. Lots of failure. Targets were missed. Arrows flew wide. Horses occasionally ignored instructions. Some students spent entire afternoons discovering new and creative ways not to hit what they were aiming at. Yet gradual improvement came. A boy who once struggled simply to stay seated in the saddle eventually learned to ride with confidence. The horse became less of an unpredictable beast and more of a trusted partner. For samurai families, this progress carried deep significance. A mounted warrior represented generations of tradition. Every lesson connected a child to ancestors who had ridden into battle long before he was born. But riding and archery were only part of the education. As boys grew older, they would begin learning something even more important than combat skills: how to face fear, hardship, and the possibility of death itself. A samurai child's education was never just about winning battles. It was about preparing for the possibility of losing them. As boys entered their early teenage years, their training began to change. The focus shifted away from simply learning techniques and toward developing character. Swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship remained important, but instructors now expected students to cultivate courage, self-control, and emotional resilience. In other words, they were expected to grow up quickly. Life in medieval Japan offered little room for prolonged adolescence. A samurai family could be called upon to serve its lord at any time. Conflict might erupt without warning. Rebellions, feuds, and wars remained a constant possibility. Boys needed to be prepared long before they officially became men. One way this was accomplished was through exposure to hardship. Comfort was not considered an effective teacher. Students trained in heat, cold, rain, and snow. They practiced despite fatigue. They learned to endure discomfort without complaint. Modern children might negotiate for an extra blanket or a day off. A samurai instructor was more likely to interpret complaints as evidence that additional training was required. The logic was simple. If a warrior could remain calm during discomfort, he would be more likely to remain calm during danger. Stories also played a major role in shaping attitudes toward fear. Young samurai constantly heard tales of famous warriors who demonstrated loyalty under impossible circumstances. Heroes remained steadfast when facing overwhelming odds. They accepted hardship without hesitation. They placed duty above personal safety. The message was impossible to miss. Fear itself was not shameful. Allowing fear to control your actions was. This distinction mattered because samurai instructors understood something universal about human nature. Even the bravest warriors experience fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to continue despite it. As boys matured, they were gradually introduced to more serious realities. They witnessed military preparations. They observed armed retainers. They listened to discussions about politics, conflict, and service. The world beyond childhood became increasingly visible. Some families even took older boys to observe executions or battlefields. The purpose was not entertainment. It was education. Life could end suddenly. Violence carried consequences. A future warrior needed to understand these truths rather than hide from them. By their mid-teens, many samurai youths already possessed skills, discipline, and emotional control that would have impressed most adults. Yet one final transformation remained. Soon they would undergo the ceremony that marked the end of childhood. The games, lessons, and practice drills would give way to adult responsibilities. The boy training to become a samurai would soon be expected to live as one. For years, a samurai boy trained, studied, obeyed instructions, endured lectures, survived archery practice, and accumulated enough bruises to convince him that adulthood could not possibly be worth the effort. Then one day, adulthood arrived anyway. The transition came through a ceremony known as genpuku. This was one of the most important moments in a young samurai's life. It marked the official passage from childhood into adulthood. After years of preparation, society would finally begin treating him as a full member of the warrior class, at least in theory. In practice, adults often continued treating young men as inexperienced for quite some time. Some traditions never change. The exact age varied depending on the period and family circumstances, but many boys underwent the ceremony during their early teenage years. For a samurai household, genpuku was both a celebration and a declaration. The child was gone. The future warrior had arrived. Preparations could be elaborate. Family members gathered. Important guests attended. Lords or senior retainers sometimes participated in the ceremony, emphasizing the young man's connection to the broader warrior community. A new hairstyle often formed part of the transition. Throughout Japanese history, hairstyles carried social meaning. Adopting the appearance of an adult warrior publicly signaled a new stage of life. The change may seem minor to modern observers, but in samurai society, it carried significant symbolic weight. The young man also received an adult name. This was more than a simple formality. Names reflected identity, status, and family connections. Receiving an adult name represented a public acknowledgement that the individual now carried responsibilities previously reserved for mature members of society. And those responsibilities were very real. After genpuku, expectations changed immediately. A young samurai could be called upon to serve his lord. He could participate in military duties, administrative work, and family obligations. The safety net of childhood began to disappear. No instructor could complete his tasks for him. No parent could constantly shield him from consequences. The lessons of discipline, loyalty, courage, and self-control were now expected to guide his actions. For many young men, the ceremony brought pride. It also brought anxiety. The reality of adulthood rarely feels as simple as childhood imagines. The heroic stories told around family hearths suddenly seemed less romantic when one became responsible for living up to them. Yet genpuku represented something larger than personal achievement. It connected each new generation to centuries of samurai tradition. Fathers watched sons complete the same transition they had once experienced. Families renewed their commitment to service and duty. The boy who had spent years learning how to become a samurai was finally considered one. Now he faced the greatest challenge of all, proving that he deserved the title. After the Genpuku ceremony, a young samurai entered a new phase of life. The years of preparation were over. Now came the reason for all that preparation in the first place: service. From childhood, every lesson had pointed toward this moment. The discipline, the literacy, the archery, the horsemanship, the endless lectures about loyalty. All of it existed because a samurai's primary purpose was to serve his lord. Not himself, not his ambitions, not his comfort. His lord. This relationship formed the foundation of samurai society. A daimyo, or feudal lord, depended on loyal retainers to govern lands, collect taxes, maintain order, and fight when necessary. In return, the lord provided protection, status, income, and opportunities for advancement. At least when everything worked properly. History contains plenty of examples where it did not. A newly adult samurai rarely began his career as a famous warrior. Most started with modest duties. They carried messages, assisted senior retainers, supervised small tasks, maintained records, or performed guard duty. It was not glamorous. No legendary battles. No dramatic duels. No heroic speeches delivered while standing on a windy cliff. Instead, there was paperwork. A surprising amount of paperwork. Many samurai spent significant portions of their lives handling administrative responsibilities. Especially during peaceful periods, literacy and organization often mattered more than swordsmanship. A man who could manage records efficiently might prove more valuable to his lord than someone who simply swung a sword well. This sometimes disappointed young warriors. After years of imagining glorious adventures, they discovered that governance required accounting. Reality can be cruel. Military training, however, never stopped. Young samurai continued practicing martial skills throughout adulthood. Archery drills, sword exercises, riding practice, and tactical instruction remained essential parts of their lives. Peace was never guaranteed, and every warrior understood that conflict could return unexpectedly. Loyalty became the defining virtue. A samurai was expected to support his lord through success and failure alike. This expectation appeared in stories, legal codes, family traditions, and everyday conversation. The ideal retainer remained faithful even during hardship. Whether real human beings always lived up to that ideal is another matter entirely. Humans have a long history of finding principles admirable right up until they become inconvenient. Still, most young samurai genuinely aspired to meet these expectations. They wanted to earn respect. They wanted to honor their families. They wanted to prove that the years of training had produced something worthwhile. As they gained experience, greater responsibilities followed. Some would become officers, advisors, administrators, or military leaders. But before any of that happened, they faced another challenge that every samurai eventually encountered. They had to learn how to navigate a world where reputation could be as important as skill, and where a single mistake could damage a family's honor for generations. By the time a samurai reached adulthood, he had spent years learning how to fight, ride, read, write, obey orders, and endure hardship. Yet one lesson overshadowed all the others. Your reputation could take a lifetime to build and a single afternoon to destroy. In samurai society, honor was not merely a personal matter. It belonged to the family, the clan, and sometimes even the lord being served. Every action reflected upon others. A careless decision did not remain your problem for long. It quickly became everyone's problem. This made daily life surprisingly complicated. A samurai was expected to be brave but not reckless, confident but not arrogant, loyal but not foolish, polite but not weak. Finding the balance required constant judgment, and human beings are not famous for making perfect decisions. Young samurai quickly learned that reputation followed them everywhere. Superiors noticed reliability. Fellow retainers observed behavior. Servants carried gossip. Rivals paid attention to mistakes. In a castle town, news traveled with remarkable speed, sometimes faster than the person involved. A missed responsibility, an argument, a drunken outburst, or a public display of cowardice could damage a reputation for years. Stories tended to grow more dramatic with every retelling. A minor mistake might eventually sound like the collapse of civilization itself. Naturally, this created pressure. Samurai families constantly reminded younger generations to protect the family name. Ancestors had spent decades, sometimes centuries, building reputations through service and sacrifice. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the relative who ruined everything because he made a foolish decision after too much sake. Stories from history reinforced these lessons. Young warriors heard countless tales of men who earned everlasting respect through loyalty and courage. They also heard stories about those who betrayed trust, abandoned duty, or disgraced themselves through selfish behavior. The heroes received admiration. The failures became warnings. Over time, these lessons shaped behavior. Many samurai developed an intense awareness of how others perceived them. Their clothing, speech, actions, and decisions all carried social consequences. This concern with honor could sometimes produce admirable results. It could also create enormous stress. Living under constant expectations was exhausting. Every generation struggled with the gap between the ideal samurai described in stories and the imperfect human being staring back from the mirror. Yet that struggle itself became part of the training, because the ultimate goal was never perfection. The goal was to live in a way that brought credit rather than shame. As the years passed, successful samurai earned trust, responsibility, and status. Some rose to positions of influence, others distinguished themselves through military service, and eventually, every warrior reached the stage where he was no longer the student. He became the teacher, responsible for passing the lessons of samurai childhood to the next generation. One day, almost without noticing it, the young samurai stopped being the youngest man in the room. The instructors who once corrected his mistakes now expected him to correct the mistakes of others. The senior retainers who once assigned him simple tasks now trusted him with greater responsibilities. And somewhere nearby stood a new generation of boys beginning the same journey he had started years before. The cycle continued. It always had. Samurai society depended on the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. Skills could not simply be written down and forgotten. Swordsmanship, archery, horsemanship, etiquette, and duty all required living examples. Every experienced warrior carried the responsibility of teaching those who followed. For many men, this realization arrived gradually. A younger relative asked for advice. A lord assigned him to supervise trainees. A son reached the age when formal instruction needed to begin. Suddenly, the lessons of childhood returned. The strict lectures that once seemed unfair now sounded surprisingly reasonable. The endless repetition of drills made more sense. The discipline that had felt burdensome revealed its value. This was deeply irritating. One of history's most universal experiences is eventually realizing that your teachers were right about at least some things. A samurai father often became his child's first instructor. He taught proper greetings, respectful behavior, and family traditions. He shared stories about ancestors and explained the responsibilities attached to the family name. Through countless small lessons, he began shaping the character of the next generation. Martial training followed naturally. The same wooden swords he once used appeared in the hands of young boys. The same archery targets stood in training grounds. The same riding lessons produced the same awkward falls and bruised pride. Children, it turned out, remained remarkably consistent across the centuries. They still became impatient. They still made mistakes. They still believed they already knew everything, and experienced adults still knew otherwise. As years passed, many samurai came to understand that the purpose of their childhood training had never been solely about war. The lessons extended far beyond the battlefield. Discipline helped them govern. Literacy helped them administer. Self-control helped them lead. Loyalty helped maintain stability in a world often threatened by conflict. The sword was important. The character behind the sword was far more important. By the end of his life, a successful samurai left behind more than military accomplishments. He left behind a legacy of instruction, example, and tradition. Through his children, students, and followers, the values he learned as a boy continued into the future. And so the story of a samurai childhood came full circle. A boy born into duty grew into a warrior. A warrior became a mentor. A mentor shaped new warriors. Generation after generation, the lessons endured, ensuring that the path of the samurai survived long after individual lives had ended.